Lest we forget to live. Albert Camus and Stoicism by Matthew Sharpe. Today marks 60 years since Albert Camus' death in a car crash, aged 46. New information sourced from KGB archives suggests that the Algerian French author, philosopher, dramatist, and activist was assassinated on Soviet orders. If we know why the Nobel-winning author of The Outsider, The Myth of Sisyphus, The Plague, and The Rebel died, however, Camus' own philosophy of life is less widely appreciated. Due to the phenomenal success of The Outsider and The Myth of Sisyphus, published under the German occupation of Paris, 1940-44, Camus was quickly touted as an existentialist, or, quote, prophet of the absurd, end quote. Yet Camus always rejected both labels. He would repeat that his formative philosophy and literary influences were the Greek poets and philosophers, hearkening back to his formative years in Algeria, studying under Jean Grenier. Camus would also point to the decisive importance for him of his own experiences growing up poor but surrounded by sunlight, and as a young footballer whose youthful idols were cut short when he was diagnosed with tuberculosis at 17 and told by his physician that he may have only 1 week to live. One needn't be a Stoic to appreciate what a profound effect this latter experience had on Camus. The young man himself turned at this moment of crisis to Stoicism, reading Epictetus in the hospital as he convalesced. Sorry, that was a little loud. One needn't be a Stoic to appreciate what a profound effect this latter experience had on Camus. The young man himself turned at this moment of crisis to Stoicism, reading Epictetus in the hospital as he convalesced. Years later, confronting one of the many adversities that defined his life, he would cite Marcus Aurelius as a source of strength in his notebooks. Wherever it is possible to live well. What prevents a work being completed becomes the work itself. What bars our way makes us travel along it. It is too much to say that Camus was a Stoic. Perhaps a neo or para-Stoic is the closer to the mark. It is anyway little known that Camus was one of the small number of 20th century philosophers of note to have been directly influenced by the ancient Greco-Roman philosophy. At the same time, many of Camus' own independently developed ideas read as uncannily familiar and sympathetic to students of the porch. It is this little remarked philosophical affinity that I want to explore here. The absurd and the benign indifference of nature. Since Camus is so widely known for the idea of the absurd, we begin with this idea. People suppose Camus' idea of the absurd to be an expression of chic Parisian despair at the godless meaninglessness of human life. Hence they see his philosophy as wholly inconsistent with any ancient or pre-modern view of the world. For Camus, though, the idea of the absurd involves the confrontation between our limited understanding and desire for unity and control with a world which resists total human comprehension, in which innocents suffer, and in which death is inevitable reality. The natural world seems not to have been created wholly to serve human goals, Camus contends. But this does not speak against a recognition of its larger worth and order. On the contrary, Camus sees our sense of natural beauty as one of the ways in which people experience the absurd. Faced with a breathtaking landscape, Camus argues, the, quote, inhuman dimension of nature reveals itself to our contemplative regard. It is a matter of what his character Meursault calls nature's, quote, benign indifference, end quote, facing imminent execution in The Outsider and gazing up at the stars. When we are moved by natural beauty, Camus writes, quote, the world evades us because it becomes itself again, end quote. We now see it shorn of the, quote, illusory meanings, end quote, with which our all too human preoccupations have clothed it, not as meaningless, but as operating according to its own logics, or logos, greater and other than our petty concerns. The very word indifference, so central to Camus' thought, sounds very familiar to a Stoic audience. Stoics know that to hold in external things are indifferent in terms of their ability to make us happy or unhappy, in no way licenses any kind of solipsistic or misanthropic withdrawal from engagement with the world. When one understands the larger order of nature, Marcus Aurelius claims, on the contrary, one can see beauty in the smallest things, like the broken crusts of baking bread, or the gaping jaws of a wild beast. As Camus concurs, we are awakened to such beauty precisely when we cease to refer everything back to our own egos, but view them with a certain disinterestedness. Quote, it is legitimate to glory in the diversity and quantity of experience, end quote. Camus maintained, quote, if one is completely disinterested in the object of one's desires, end quote. Poverty, sunshine, and tuberculosis. As we mentioned above, Camus would always maintain that the basis of his philosophy lay more in his own specific experiences than in his formal education. Camus' father died in the trenches in 1914, when Albert was only 1. He was raised by his largely silent but devoted mother and his grandmother in the sweltering heat of the poorest quarters of French Algiers. Albert was the first of his family to go to high school, let alone university. In truly Stoic fashion, however, Camus credited his childhood poverty with shaping his conceptions of happiness, life, and philosophy. Growing up poor, Camus claimed, enabled him to look down upon the riches and others envy and struggle for, as if these were the real basis of a good life. It made him see, as Epictetus would concur, that such goods are at most preferable to have or attain, and that their very absence can be a source of inner wealth. Quote, for me, Camus echoes the old Stoic paradoxes, quote, the greatest luxury has coincided with a certain bareness, end quote. When it is inner strength or virtue that is at issue, quote, the underworker at the post office can be the equivalent of the conqueror, end quote, in his eyes. Quote, what could a man want that is better than poverty? End quote. Camus asks his readers quite seriously. Quote, I do not say misery any more than I mean the work without hope of the modern proletarian, but I do not see that one could desire more than poverty with an active leisure. The other experience which shaped the royal privilege, as Camus calls it, of his neo-Stoic disinterestedness towards external things is his lived experience of the imminence of death because of the tuberculosis that continually dogged him throughout his short life. In a remarkable fragment from his notebooks, Camus writes of a memento mori few of us, preferably, will have to entertain. The sensation of death, which from now on is so familiar to me, to have a foreboding of death, simply at the sight of a pocket handkerchief filled with blood, is to be effortlessly plunged back into time in the most breathtaking manner. It is the terror of becoming. Once we understand Camus' sense that he could quite literal, lit, literal, literally die. I don't know why I had such a hard time with that. Once we understand Camus' sense that he could quite literally die at almost any moment, we comprehend the urgency of his repeated stress upon the importance of memento mori throughout his work, most famously in the idea of absurd freedom in the myth of Sisyphus. Quote, "There is only one liberty in coming to terms with death," end quote, Camus reflects in his notebooks, evoking Seneca's famous maxim, quote, "The person who has learned how to die has unlearned how to be a slave," end quote. But isn't it a paradox for Camus to think that coming to terms with this inevitability is key to feeling truly free? Someone may ask. If it is again a very Stoic kind of paradox. For Camus agrees with the Stoics that the liberty here is an inner affair. It comes from being free from worry about what after all cannot be controlled, our mortality, instead focusing on what we can alter or affect. As Camus enjoins himself in his notebooks, always with his tuberculosis in mind, quote, "The degradation involved in all forms of suffering. One must not give in to emptiness. Try to conquer and fulfill time. Time, don't waste it," end quote. Or again, quote, "Don't forget illness and the decay it brings. There is not a minute to lose," which is perhaps the opposite of "we must hurry," end quote. Self-writing, forgetfulness, and paying attention. Perhaps the most remarkable contrast between Camus' neo-Stoicism and the academic, theoretical philosophy predominant in his and our times lies in how Camus, like the Stoics, conceived of philosophy as an ongoing exercise in learning how better to live and to die. The most remarkable source of testimony we have to Camus' philosophical practice and self-conception is his extant notebooks. The work of philosophy, for Camus as for the Stoics, involves trying constantly to have at hand prochirion one's key ideas faced with the challenges of existence. Quote, "The primary faculty of man is forgetfulness," end quote, Camus laments. "The force of habit and our immersion in 1,000 distractions lulls the eyes of our minds to sleep. The wonder of beauty, the fugacity of time, the unique value and dignity of others, all of these realities are easily crowded out by the demands and vexations of everyday life." Quote, "As everything finally becomes a matter of habit, we can be certain that even great thoughts and great actions become insignificant. End quote. However, as a Camusian note from 1950 remarks, quote, with a strong memory, you can create a precious experience. End quote. What is at stake in this philosophical cultivation of memory is a kind of asceticism, albeit one pursued in the name of self-fulfillment, not monastic self-denial. One single unchanging subject for meditation. Reject everything else. Work continuously at a definite time with no falling off, etc. Moral training and asceticism too. A single moment of weakness and everything collapses, both practice and theory. Camus calls the ideal mode of mindful awareness such an asceticism can create lucidity or clear-sightedness. And again, the way Camus describes its features sounds familiar to modern practitioners of Stoicism.
Asceticism.
Severe self-discipline and avoidance of all forms of indulgence, typically for religious reasons. Asceticism. Firstly, there is a cultivated attention to the present moment. Quote, a continued presence of self with self, not happiness, but awareness, as Camus says. Quote, the present and the succession of presence before constantly conscious soul. End quote. Happiness itself, Camus remarks, is, quote, a long patience. End quote. Secondly, there is a sense of life as a gift, one meriting that gratitude writ so large in Book 1 of Marcus's Meditations, wherein the philosopher-emperor, patiently recalls and thanks each person who benefited him in his formative years. So too, Camus will come to value above all a simple solidarity with others as amongst life's greatest goods, given the realities of suffering, death, political polarization, and hatred. Quote, now I have learned to expect less of people than they can give, a silent companionship, and their emotions, their friendship and noble gestures keep their full miraculous value in my eyes, wholly the fruit of grace. End quote. Memento vivere, I believe that means a reminder to live. Yes, remember to live. Memento mori is a reminder that you are going to die. I guess it probably means
Memento mori.
an object serving as a warning or a reminder of death, such as a skull. Memento vivere. The 60th anniversary of Camus' death falls at the beginning of another year, 2020, destined to be marked by division and acrimony. Yeah, so I don't know when this was written, but I guess it was written before the insurrection. Sounds like it beginning of 2020. And I guess, yeah, we had an insurrection since then. Okay, sorry, back to the article. The solidarity between peoples which Camus dreamed of, a secular kingdom of man, or cosmopolis, seems every bit as idealistic now as it did when he envisaged it in the 1940s. Different political actors have, and will continue, to claim Camus as one of their own, from conservatives to liberals and socialists, eloquent tribute to the power of his post-war political thinking and example. Other voices blame Camus for his failure to secure a civilian truce in the Algerian conflict, and his continuing inability to accept the need for the complete end of French Algeria, with resettlement of the Pieds Noirs in continental France. What we have aimed at here is to show how Camus, as well as a political thinker and actor, was also a philosopher in the ancient mold, who conceived and tried to live an examined life profoundly close to, and influenced by, the model of the ancient Stoics, one characterized by inner discipline, attention to the present moment, openness to natural beauty, indifference towards externals, awareness of the limitations of human understanding and the inevitability of death, and a profound sense of sympathetic solidarity with the others. That seems like a great summary of both Stoicism and Camus. I'll have to write that down. This side of our political divisions, as Stoics or just as human beings, different readers can still find wisdom in Camus' philosophy of life, as well as his thought and example 60 years after his premature passing. So, let me close in Camus' own words, exhorting himself stoically in his notebooks in what became his final years, in words which can equally be read as exhortations to us all. Remain close to the reality of beings and things. Return as often as possible to personal happiness. Recover energy as the central force. Recognize the need for enemies. Love that they exist. Recover the greatest strength, not to dominate, but to give. I thought that was a great article. Author is Gregory Sadler, editor of Stoicism Today, president of Reason.io, adjunct professor at Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design. I definitely haven't heard that Camus was assassinated. Where was that? New information sourced from KGB archives suggests that the Algerian French author, philosopher, dramatist, and activist was assassinated on Soviet orders. I'm going to read a little bit of this at least. Albert Camus might have been killed by the KGB for criticizing the Soviet Union, claims newspaper. Car crash in which French literary giant was killed in 1960 was no accident, claims New Theory. I guess maybe I'll do another video if I'm going to read this. Thanks for listening.